Her gift came with a card. Play the USB before you say I do. I almost didn't. I stared at the USB drive lying next to my wedding dress, my hands shaking as I read the card again. The morning of what should have been the happiest day of my life had just become the beginning of my worst nightmare. Someone had slipped this small package under my hotel room door, and the message was clear. Play this before walking down the aisle. I almost threw it away, thinking it was some cruel prank from a jealous ex or bitter family member. But something about the careful handwriting, the deliberate placement made me pause. But before we continue, tap the hype button. It's free and really helps push this story to more people. The USB contained footage that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my fiancé David and my life. 3 years of planning, 200 guests waiting downstairs, and a reception that cost more than most people's cars. All of it built on lies I was about to discover. The woman on the recording spoke with quiet certainty about David's double life, providing dates, locations, and details that made my stomach drop. She had been his girlfriend for the past 18 months, living in an apartment he rented across town, believing they would marry once his family obligations were settled. The final clip showed them together just 2 days ago. Him promising her that after this weekend, he would be free to start their real life together. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my silk robe, watching my reflection in the mirror across the room. My makeup was perfect, my hair arranged in the elegant updo we had practiced 3 times, but my face had gone completely white. The woman in the video had provided bank statements showing David had been supporting her lifestyle with money from our joint savings account, money I had contributed from my inheritance after my grandmother's death. She had text messages where he called me his safety net and described our relationship as comfortable but passionless. But the most devastating part came at the end when she explained why she was sending me this evidence. The mysterious woman revealed that David planned to propose to her using my grandmother's engagement ring, the same ring he had falsely claimed he'd inherited from his own grandmother when he proposed to me. She'd discovered the lie when she found our wedding announcement online, realizing that David had been playing both of us. Unlike me, she decided to fight back instead of becoming another victim of his deception. She had spent months gathering evidence, following him, documenting his lies, and she wanted me to know the truth before I legally bound myself to a man who saw me as nothing more than financial security. Her final words on the recording were simple, but devastating. You deserve better than being someone's backup plan. I walked to the window, overlooking the hotel's garden where my guests were beginning to gather for the ceremony. Aunts and uncles, who had traveled from across the country, college friends who had rearranged their schedules, David's family who had welcomed me with what I now realized was calculated warmth. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, holding their phones, ready to capture what they believed would be a beautiful moment. David was probably downstairs right now, adjusting his tie and accepting congratulations from his groomsmen, playing the role of the nervous but excited groom. The thought of his performance made my hands clench into fists. The hotel room felt smaller with each passing minute as I considered my options. I could pretend I had never seen the USB, walk downstairs and marry a man who had been betraying me for more than half of our relationship. I could expose him in front of everyone, creating a scene that would become family legend for all the wrong reasons. Or I could disappear, leaving everyone to wonder what had happened to the bride who simply vanished on her wedding day. None of these choices felt right. But sitting in that room, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered dreams, I realized that David had underestimated the woman he had chosen to deceive. The USB drive sat on my dresser like a small black tombstone, marking the death of my naive trust. But as I looked at it, I felt something unexpected rising in my chest. Not just heartbreak, but a cold, clear anger that sharpened my thinking instead of clouding it. David had spent years carefully constructing this deception, using my love and my money to build a life with another woman while keeping me as his insurance policy. He had calculated every move, every lie, every stolen dollar, believing I was too trusting to ever discover the truth. As I stood there in my wedding dress, I realized that his biggest mistake was assuming I would remain the passive, grateful woman he had been manipulating. I had exactly 45 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. and I used every second to transform from heartbroken bride into something far more dangerous. First, I called the hotel's business center and asked them to make copies of everything on the USB drive, paying extra for rush service and discreet handling. The clerk, a young woman who probably dealt with wedding drama regularly, asked no questions when I requested multiple copies on different formats. While I waited, I sat in the business center's small office writing a list of everyone who needed to know the truth. David's parents, his boss at the law firm, our mutual friends, and most importantly, the vendors who were still owed money for services they believed they were providing to a legitimate couple. The hotel clerk returned with a manila envelope containing printed screenshots, DVD copies, and additional USB drives, all organized with the efficiency of someone who understood that timing was everything. I paid her in cash and asked her to hold the envelope at the front desk under my maiden name, accessible only with the password truth. Then I returned to my room and began the delicate process of getting ready for a performance. That would require every skill I had learned from years of navigating difficult family dynamics and professional challenges. I applied my makeup with steady hands, pinned my veil with precise movements, and practiced my smile in the mirror until it looked natural instead of murderous. 20 minutes before the ceremony, I called David's phone and listened to his excited, slightly nervous voice as he asked if I was ready to become his wife. The irony of his question made my jaw clench, but I kept my voice light and loving as I told him I couldn't wait to see him at the altar. I mentioned that I had a special surprise for him after the ceremony, something I had been planning for weeks that would show him exactly how much our relationship meant to me. He laughed and said he loved surprises, especially from me, and promised he had a few surprises of his own planned for our honeymoon. Every word felt like swallowing glass, but I needed him confident and unsuspecting for what came next. I met my father in the hotel lobby, and he immediately sensed something was wrong despite my careful composure. He had always been able to read my mood 7 when I tried to hide them, and the concern in his eyes almost broke my resolve. I linked my arm through his and told him that everything was perfect, that I had never been more certain about anything in my life, which was technically true, even if not in the way he understood. As we walked toward the garden where the ceremony would take place, I could see the guests settling into their seats, the photographer positioning himself for the perfect shot, and the officiant checking his notes one final time. David stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his smile confident and bright as he watched me approach. The walk down the aisle felt both endless and too short, giving me time to study the faces of everyone who had gathered to witness what they believed was a celebration of true love. David's mother dabbed at her ease with a lace handkerchief. His father stood proud and straight, and our friends held their phones, ready to capture the moment when we promised to love and honor each other for the rest of our lives. I smiled at each of them, nodded gracefully to familiar faces, and kept my steps measured and bridey, even as my mind raced through the final details of what would happen after the ceremony. When I reached the altar, David took my hands and whispered that I looked beautiful, that he was the luckiest man alive, and that he couldn't wait to start our life together. The officiant began the ceremony with words about love, trust, and the sacred bond of marriage, and I listened to every phrase while watching David's face for any sign of guilt or hesitation. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a successful young lawyer marrying the woman of his dreams, ready to build a future based on mutual respect and genuine affection. His answers to the traditional questions were clear and confident, his vows personal and touching, and when he slipped the ring onto my finger, his hands were steady and warm. If I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes, I might have believed that this moment was as real for him as it appeared to be for everyone else watching. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to this union, the garden fell into the traditional moment of silence, and I felt my heart pound as I considered standing up and objecting to my own wedding. Instead, I squeezed David's hands and smiled at him with all the love I could summon, knowing that in a few hours he would understand exactly what that smile had really meant. The ceremony concluded with our kiss as husband and wife, and the garden erupted in applause and cheers from people who genuinely cared about our happiness. As we walked back down the aisle together, David's arm around my waist and both Ophis waving to our guests. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt any guilt at all about the woman waiting for him in an apartment across town, or if compartmentalization came as naturally to him as breathing. But as we posed for photos with our families, David pulling me close and whispering jokes to make me laugh for the camera, I realized that his greatest strength as a liar was about to become his fatal weakness. The reception began exactly as planned, with David and me making our grand entrance to thunderous applause, and the photographer capturing every moment of what appeared to be pure joy. We danced our first dance to the song we had chosen months ago, and David held me close, spinning me gracefully and smiling at me as if I were the only person in the room. His performance was flawless, and I matched it with my own, laughing at his whispered comments and gazing at him with the adoration that 100 wedding guests expected to see. But while we swayed to the music, I was mentally reviewing the timeline I had constructed during the ceremony, calculating exactly when and how I would reveal the truth about the man who was now legally my husband. During dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom and instead went to the hotel's front desk to retrieve the envelope I had left there. The clerk handed it over with a discreet nod, and I quickly walked to the empty conference room next to our reception hall that I had reserved that morning for wedding surprises. I spent 10 minutes setting up the hotel's audio-visual equipment, testing the connections, and ensuring that everything would work perfectly when the moment arrived. The DVD played clearly on the large screen. The audio was sharp and understandable, and the remote control responded immediately to every command. I also arranged for copies of the printed evidence to be distributed to specific tables, with the hotel staff instructed to place them discreetly next to certain guest plates during the final course. I returned to the reception as the toasts were beginning and listened to David's best man talk about their friendship and how David had found his perfect match in me. The irony was almost unbearable, but I smiled and applauded at the appropriate moments, even raising my champagne glass when the toast concluded with wishes for our long and happy marriage. David's father spoke next, welcoming me to their family and praising David's character and integrity, words that would seem particularly painful in retrospect. My own father's toast was brief but heartfelt, expressing his confidence that David would take care of me and that we would build something beautiful together. Each speaker was sincere and loving, which made what I was about to do feel both necessary and devastating. As the evening progressed, I watched David work the room with the skill of a natural politician, shaking hands with the men, charming the women, and playing the role of devoted husband whenever someone commented on how happy we looked together. He had perfected this performance over months of engagement parties and wedding planning events, and I realized that his ability to compartmentalize his double life had probably made him feel powerful and clever rather than guilty. When elderly relatives praised him for finding such a wonderful girl, and younger cousins asked for relationship advice, he responded with confidence and apparent sincerity. But I noticed that he checked his phone regularly, probably managing communications with his girlfriend, who must have been wondering why he wasn't responding to her messages. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived when the band announced that the bride and groom would be sharing some special words with their guests. David looked surprised but pleased, assuming I was planning some romantic gesture, or perhaps a special thank you to our families for their support. I walked to the microphone with steady steps, my dress rustling softly in the sudden quiet of the reception hall. 200 faces turned toward me expectantly, phones raised to record what they assumed would be a touching moment of gratitude and love. David stood beside me, his arm around my waist and his smile confident, ready to play his part in whatever surprise I had planned. I began by thanking everyone for traveling to celebrate with us, for their generous gifts, and for their love and support during our engagement. My voice was clear and warm, and I could see people settling back in their chairs with satisfied smiles, ready to hear the kind of heartfelt speech that would make them feel good about attending our wedding. I talked about how marriage was built on trust, honesty, and the willingness to share your whole life with another person. David nodded along, squeezing my waist affectionately, completely unaware that every word I spoke was designed to make what came next even more devastating. I mentioned how important it was to really know the person you were marrying, to understand their character, their values, and their capacity for faithfulness. Then I paused, smiled at David with what must have looked like pure love, and told our guests that I'd recently received some information that I wanted to share with everyone because transparency and truth were the foundation of any strong marriage. David's expression began to change as I reached for the remote control I had hidden behind the microphone stand, his smile faltering slightly as he sensed that something unexpected was about to happen. I clicked the button and the large screen behind us flickered to life, displaying the first image from the USB drive. David with his arms around another woman, both of them laughing in front of an apartment building that none of our wedding guests had ever seen. The reception hall fell into absolute silence as the video began to play. The first few seconds of silence were broken by gasps and whispers as our wedding guests tried to process what they were seeing on the large screen behind us. David's face went from confusion to horror as he recognized the woman in the video and realized that his carefully constructed double life was being exposed in front of everyone who mattered to him. He reached for the microphone, probably planning to explain or deny what was happening, but I stepped smoothly away from him and continued speaking in the same calm, clear voice I had been using to thank our guests. I explained that what they were watching was footage of my husband with his girlfriend of 18 months, a woman who lived in an apartment he rented with money from our joint savings account. The video continued playing behind me as I provided commentary like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, my voice never rising above conversational level even as the content became more damaging. I pointed out the dates visible in the footage, showing that some of these intimate moments had occurred during our engagement party weekend when David had told me he was working late on an important case. The woman in the video appeared happy and comfortable, clearly believing she was in a committed relationship with a man who would soon be free to marry her. When the footage showed them together in what was obviously her bedroom, decorated with photos of the two of them that spanned more than a year, several guests stood up and began walking toward the exit, unable to watch anymore. David finally found his voice and began demanding that I stop the video, his composed facade cracking as he realized that his reputation, his career, and his relationships were being destroyed in real time. He grabbed my arm and tried to pull me away from the microphone, but I calmly moved away from him and continued my presentation, explaining to our guests that the woman had contacted me because she had discovered David's deception when she found our wedding announcement online. His parents sat frozen at their table, his mother's face white with shock, and his father's expression shifting from confusion to anger as he began to understand the scope of his son's betrayal. My own parents looked stricken but determined to support me, and I could see my father's jaw clenching as he processed what his new son-in-law had been doing behind my back. The most devastating part of the video came next. Audio recordings of David talking to his girlfriend about our relationship, describing me as his safety net, and explaining how he planned to maintain both relationships until he decided which one offered him better long-term prospects. His voice was clear and unmistakable as he talked about using my inheritance money to support his girlfriend's lifestyle while I believed we were saving for our future together. He laughed about my trust, called me conveniently naive, and described our physical relationship in terms that made several people gasp with shock and embarrassment. When he talked about proposing to his girlfriend with my grandmother's ring after our honeymoon, claiming he would tell me it had been stolen, even his most loyal friends looked sick. I paused the video and turned to face David directly, my voice still calm, but carrying a coldness that made the entire reception hall feel like a courtroom during a murder trial. I asked him if he wanted to explain to our guests why he had chosen our wedding day to continue his deception, why he had looked into my eyes 20 minutes ago and promised to love and honor me while knowing he planned to betray me before our honeymoon was over. He stammered something about the video being fake, about being set up by someone who wanted to destroy him. But his denial sounded hollow and desperate in contrast to the clear evidence everyone had just witnessed. Several of his groomsmen were staring at him with expressions of disgust and disbelief, and his best man quietly removed his benaire and placed it on the table as if distancing himself from any association with David. The hotel staff began distributing the printed evidence I had prepared, placing copies of bank statements, text messages screenshots, and apartment lease documents at tables throughout the reception hall. David's boss, a distinguished partner at the law firm where David worked, studied the financial documents with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what they were seeing. When he looked up at David, his expression was cold and professional. The look of a man who had just discovered that one of his employees was not only morally compromised, but potentially guilty of financial improprieties that could damage the firm's reputation. David's college friends passed the documents between them, their faces showing the painful process of reevaluating years of friendship in light of this new information about his character. I reached the final section of my presentation, explaining to our guests that I had discovered this information only that morning and had chosen to share it with them because they deserved to know the truth about the man they had come to celebrate. I thanked them for their presence, their gifts, and their support, and I assured them that while this was certainly not the wedding celebration any of us had expected, it was probably the most honest moment David had experienced in years. As I spoke, David stood beside me, looking completely defeated, his shoulders slumped and his face gray with the realization that his life as he had known it was effectively over. But as I handed the microphone back to the bandleader and smiled at our stunned guests, I realized that this public humiliation was only the beginning of what David would pay for his betrayal. The reception hall erupted into chaos as guests began standing, talking loudly among themselves, and gathering their belongings while David remained frozen at the front of the room, like a defendant waiting for sentencing. His girlfriend's evidence had been thorough and devastating, but I had spent the morning preparing additional consequences that would unfold over the coming weeks. Rather than ending with tonight's public humiliation, while David tried unsuccessfully to explain himself to his parents, who were staring at him as if he were a stranger, I calmly walked to each table and personally thanked specific guests for attending, as if this had been a perfectly normal wedding reception that had simply concluded earlier than expected. I stopped first at the table where David's boss sat with his wife and several other partners from the law firm, and I quietly mentioned that the financial documents they had received showed not only David's personal dishonesty, but also his use of funds that should have been reserved for legitimate marital expenses. His boss nodded grimly and asked if I would be available to discuss the matter further, since the firm had strict policies about partners who demonstrated questionable judgment in their personal finances. I assured him that I would be happy to provide any additional documentation he might need, and I could see him already calculating the professional implications of having an employee whose personal conduct could damage client relationships and the firm's reputation. David's parents approached me as I finished speaking with his boss, and his mother's eyes were red with tears, while his father looked angry and embarrassed in equal measure. They apologized profusely for their son's behavior, expressing shock that they had raised someone capable of such elaborate deception and cruelty. His father asked what they could do to help me recover from the financial damage David had caused, and I appreciated their sincerity while explaining that David alone was responsible for making amends. His mother hugged me tightly and whispered that I had shown tremendous courage by exposing the truth rather than living with his lies, and that they would remember me as the daughter-in-law who deserved so much better than what their son had given her. My own parents flanked me protectively as more guests approached to offer support and express their outrage at David's behavior. And I could see the mixture of pride and concern in their faces as they watched me handle this devastating situation with dignity and composure. My father quietly asked if I needed legal representation for the divorce proceedings that would obviously follow, and I assured him that I had already researched my options and would be taking immediate steps to protect myself financially and legally. My mother held my hand and told me that she had never been prouder of my strength, that watching me refuse to be victimized had reminded her why she had always believed I could handle anything life presented to me. As the reception hall gradually emptied, David finally approached me with desperate eyes and began pleading for a private conversation where he could explain everything and ask for my forgiveness. He claimed that his relationship with the other woman had never been serious, that I was the only person he truly loved, and that he would do anything to repair the damage he had caused to our marriage and our families. His words sounded hollow and calculated, the same smooth persuasion he had probably used to maintain two relationships simultaneously. And I listened to him with the detached interest of someone observing a pathological liar in action. When he finished his plea, I told him calmly that he had misunderstood the situation entirely. I explained that I had no intention of trying to salvage our marriage or giving him opportunities to create new lies to cover the old ones, and that my goal was not reconciliation, but rather ensuring that he faced appropriate consequences for his choices. He looked confused, as if he couldn't quite believe that the woman he had manipulated so successfully was refusing to play her expected role as the forgiving victim. I told him that the public exposure tonight was only the first step in a longer process, and that they would discover over the coming weeks exactly how thoroughly his life was about to change. His confusion turned to fear as he began to realize that I had planned this confrontation with the same careful attention to detail that he had used to orchestrate his betrayal. The hotel staff began clearing the reception hall around us, removing centerpieces and folding chairs while David and I stood in our wedding clothes, having what would be our last conversation as husband and wife. I removed my wedding ring and placed it on the head table next to the untouched wedding cake, explaining that I had already contacted a divorce attorney and would be filing papers first thing Monday morning. David stared at the ring as if he couldn't quite process what was happening, and I realized that his shock came not just from being exposed, but from encountering a version of me that he had never seen before. For 3 years, I had been accommodating, trusting, and eager to please. Exactly the kind of woman who would make an ideal victim for someone like him. But as I walked out of the reception hall in my wedding dress, leaving David standing alone among the debris of his carefully constructed lies, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just vindication, but anticipation for everything that was still to come. I spent my wedding night in the hotel's presidential suite that David and I were supposed to share. But instead of celebrating our new marriage, I used the time to finalize plans for the legal and financial consequences that would begin unfolding on Monday morning. The divorce attorney I had contacted during my lunch break was expecting my call first thing in the morning, and she had already begun preparing paperwork based on the evidence I had emailed her. The financial documents from David's girlfriend showed clear patterns of marital funds being diverted for non-marital purposes, which in our state would have significant implications for property division and spousal support. I also had screenshots of text messages where David discussed hiding assets and manipulating our joint accounts, evidence that would make his position in divorce court extremely difficult. While David presumably spent the night trying to explain himself to his girlfriend, who had undoubtedly seen news of our wedding and the dramatic reception either through social media or mutual acquaintances, I was researching the professional consequences he would face at his law firm. Legal professionals were held to high ethical standards, and partners who demonstrated dishonesty in their personal lives often found their professional credibility damaged beyond repair. His boss had already indicated interest in reviewing the financial evidence, and I knew that clients who discovered their attorney's personal conduct would likely question his professional integrity as well. The legal community was surprisingly small, and news of his deception would spread quickly through professional networks. Sunday morning brought a steady stream of phone calls from wedding guests who wanted to check on my well-being and express their continuing shock at David's behavior. And I fielded each conversation with gracious composure while gathering additional information about his activities. Several friends mentioned that they had always felt something was off about David, but had dismissed their concerns out of respect for my happiness, and now they were providing details about suspicious behavior they had observed over the months. His college roommate called to apologize for not speaking up sooner. About David's pattern of dishonesty dating back to their university days, including academic cheating and relationship betrayals that had apparently been consistent features of his character. I also received an unexpected call from David's girlfriend, whose voice was shaky, but determined as she apologized for her role in the deception and thanked me for having the courage to expose the truth. She explained that she had spent months gathering evidence because she suspected David was lying about his circumstances, but she had never imagined the scope of his betrayal until she saw our wedding announcement, and realized that he had been planning to marry both of us. Shufford to provide additional documentation of David's lies and financial manipulation, including evidence that he had been using money from our joint account to pay for expensive gifts and vacations with her. Her willingness to cooperate would strengthen both our positions in any legal proceedings. Monday morning arrived with the efficiency of a military operation as I began implementing the consequences I had been planning since Saturday morning. My divorce attorney filed papers within an hour of her office opening, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting temporary restraining orders on our joint accounts to prevent further unauthorized withdrawals. The bank froze the accounts immediately upon receiving the court order, which meant that David would discover his financial situation had changed dramatically when he tried to access funds for his normal weekly expenses. I also filed complaints with his professional licensing board, providing evidence of his dishonest conduct and questionable financial practices that reflected poorly on the legal profession. The most satisfying call of the morning was to our landlord, informing him that I would not be returning to the apartment David and I had shared, and that David would be solely responsible for the lease going forward. Since the lease was in both our names, David would need to qualify independently for the full financial obligation, and given his current circumstances, that might prove challenging. I arranged to have my personal belongings retrieved by professional movers while David was at work, ensuring that I would never have to see him again except in legal settings where attorneys would handle our communication. The movers had strict instructions to take only items that belonged to me personally, leaving behind anything that could be considered marital property until the court made those determinations. By noon on Monday, David's carefully organized life had been completely disrupted, and he was discovering that the consequences of his choices extended far beyond one evening of public embarrassment. His access to marital funds had been frozen. His professional reputation was under investigation. His living situation was uncertain, and his personal relationships had been permanently damaged by the revelation of his dishonesty. I had spent 3 days transforming from a trusting fiancé into a strategic opponent, and David was learning that the woman he had underestimated was far more capable of protecting herself than he had ever imagined. But as I signed the initial filing to dissolve our marriage and reclaim my independence, I realized that David's real punishment would come not from any action I took, but from having to live with the consequences of his own choices. The media attention began unexpectedly when someone posted video clips from our wedding reception on social media, and the story of the bride who exposed her groom's double life at their own wedding went viral within 48 hours. Local news stations picked up the story, carefully avoiding using our real names, but providing enough details that anyone who knew us could identify the situation. The narrative that emerged was overwhelmingly supportive of my decision to confront David publicly, with commenters praising my courage and expressing outrage at his deception. Several relationship experts were interviewed about the psychological impact of discovering infidelity, and they universally condemned David's calculated betrayal as particularly cruel and damaging. David's law firm moved swiftly to limit their professional exposure, announcing within a week that he had been placed on administrative leave, pending a thorough review of his conduct and its potential impact on client relationships. The legal community's response was swift and harsh, with several prominent attorneys privately expressing concern that David's personal dishonesty reflected poorly on the profession's reputation for integrity and trustworthiness. His cases were quietly reassigned to other partners, and clients began asking pointed questions about the firm's hiring practices and ethical standards. The professional consequences were mounting faster than David could have anticipated, and his career trajectory was fundamentally altered by decisions he had made in his personal life. I received dozens of messages from women who had experienced similar betrayals, sharing their stories and thanking me for refusing to suffer in silence or protect a man who had shown me no consideration. Many of them described years of therapy, financial struggles, and emotional recovery that followed their discoveries of infidelity, and they expressed admiration for my decision to take immediate action rather than trying to salvage a relationship built on lies. Their support was both encouraging and sobering, as I realized that David's behavior represented a pattern that affected far more women than I had ever imagined. Some of these women had children and financial complications that made their situations more complex than mine, and I felt grateful that I had discovered the truth before creating additional entanglements. The divorce proceedings moved forward with remarkable efficiency, partly because David's attorney advised him to accept a settlement, rather than fighting allegations that were supported by overwhelming evidence. The financial documentation provided by his girlfriend demonstrated clear misuse of marital funds, and David's text messages about hiding assets would make any court battle extremely unfavorable for him. He agreed to return all money he had taken from our joint accounts, including funds used to support his girlfriend's lifestyle, and he waived any claim to property I had brought into the marriage. The settlement also included provisions requiring him to pay my legal fees and costs associated with the wedding that he had attended under false pretenses. My attorney informed me that David's girlfriend had also consulted with legal counsel about recovering money he had taken under false pretenses, and she was considering both civil litigation and criminal fraud charges depending on how he responded to demands for restitution. The apartment lease he had signed for her was another financial obligation that would continue 4 months, and his obligations to multiple women were creating a financial burden that his reduced income could not easily support. His elaborate deception was collapsing into a complex web of legal and financial consequences that would affect him for years to come. Long after the initial scandal had been forgotten by everyone except those directly involved, I found myself in the unexpected position of being financially better off after my divorce than I had been during my marriage, since the settlement required David to compensate me for his theft while also removing his access to my future income. The house I purchased with my recovered funds was smaller but entirely mine, decorated according to my preferences and free from any reminders of the relationship that had dominated 3 years of my life. Friends and family members commented on how different I seemed, more confident and decisive, as if the experience of successfully protecting myself had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. The woman who had been willing to trust completely had evolved into someone who verified carefully and protected herself strategically. 3 months after our wedding day, I received a phone call from David's mother, who asked if she could visit to apologize in person and to provide me with some additional information she thought I should know. Her voice was tired and sad, and I could hear the strain of dealing with her son's disgrace and its impact on their family's reputation. When she arrived at my new home, she looked older and more fragile than I remembered, as if the shock of discovering David's true character had fundamentally changed her understanding of the person she had raised. She handed me a small jewelry box and explained that it contained the wedding band I had left on the head table after their reception. The hotel had turned it in, and his parents picked it up for safekeeping. My grandmother's engagement ring had remained with me the entire time. David's mother sat in my living room with tears in her eyes as she explained how she and her husband had discovered additional evidence of their son's deceptive behavior while helping him move out of our former apartment. Among his belongings, they had found documents showing that his double life was even more extensive than anyone had realized, including credit cards opened in his name that had been used to finance expensive purchases for his girlfriend. The financial obligations he had hidden from everyone, including his parents, painted a picture of someone who had been living far beyond his means while maintaining the appearance of responsible success. His mother's voice shook as she described finding love letters from his girlfriend dating back nearly 2 years, filled with references to promises David had made about their future together after he resolved his family commitments. She also revealed that David had apparently borrowed money from his parents on multiple occasions, claiming he was investing in our future together when he was actually funding his secret relationship. The money they had given him for our wedding expenses had instead been used for a weekend trip with his girlfriend to a luxury resort, complete with spa treatments and fine dining that he had documented in photos his parents found on his computer. His father, a retired military officer who valued honor and integrity above all else, had been so disgusted by these discoveries that he had initially refused to help David with his legal problems, telling his son that he would need to face the consequences of his choices without family assistance. The most devastating revelation came when David's mother explained that she had contacted his girlfriend to apologize for her son's behavior and to offer whatever support she could to another woman who had been victimized by David's lies. During their conversation, the girlfriend had mentioned that David had told her his parents disapproved of me and were pressuring him to end our engagement, which was why their relationship had remained secret until he could break free from his family's expectations. The elaborate fiction he had created to maintain both relationships included portraying his own parents as villains who were preventing him from following his heart, while simultaneously telling me that his parents adored me and considered me the perfect daughter-in-law. His mother's voice broke completely as she described realizing that David had manipulated everyone who loved him, using their trust and affection as tools in his deception rather than viewing them as people deserving honesty and respect. She had spent weeks questioning her parenting, wondering how she had raised someone capable of such calculated cruelty, and she wanted me to know that she and her husband felt personally responsible for the pain their son had caused me. I assured her that David's choices reflected his character, not their parenting, but I could see that the shame and disappointment would probably affect their family relationships for years to come. The ring she returned to me felt heavier than I remembered, weighted with the knowledge of how David had used it as a prop in multiple deceptions. After David's mother left, I sat alone in my quiet house and tried to process the full scope of what I had discovered about the man I had almost spent my life with. His ability to lie convincingly to people who loved him, to manipulate their emotions and exploit their trust, suggested a level of psychological sophistication that was both impressive and terrifying. The David I had fallen in love with had been a carefully constructed character designed to appeal to my values and desires, while the real David remained hidden behind layers of deception that extended into every aspect of his life. I realized that I had never actually known him at all, and that our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of deliberate lies rather than genuine connection. The social media attention surrounding our story had evolved from initial shock and sympathy into broader conversations about relationship red flags and the importance of financial transparency between partners. Several personal finance experts used our situation as a case study in protecting individual assets and maintaining awareness of joint account activity. Dating coaches began incorporating our story into workshops about recognizing manipulation and maintaining independence within committed relationships. While I appreciated that our experience might help other women avoid similar situations, the constant public discussion of my private pain was emotionally exhausting and made moving forward more complicated than I had anticipated. 6 months after our wedding day, I received notice that David had been formally disciplined by the State Bar Association for conduct that reflected poorly on the legal profession, and his license had been suspended pending completion of ethics training and community service. His former law firm had quietly terminated his employment, citing irreconcilable differences in professional values, and he was reportedly working as a paralegal for a small practice that specialized in personal injury cases. The career he had spent years building was effectively over, and he was starting again in a field where his professional reputation would always be compromised by the public record of his personal conduct. His girlfriend had moved back to her home state after deciding that their relationship was irreparably damaged by the foundation of lies on which it had been built. I also learned through mutual acquaintances that David was attending therapy and had reportedly expressed genuine remorse for his actions, though I remained skeptical about his capacity for authentic change given the sophistication of his previous deceptions. Several people suggested that I consider meeting with him to discuss his apologies and efforts at personal growth, but I had no interest in providing him with opportunities for additional manipulation or in helping him feel better about the consequences of his choices. The closure I needed came from my own healing and growth, not from witnessing his attempts at redemption or offering him forgiveness that he had not earned through genuine accountability. My new life was smaller but more authentic than the future I had planned with David, and I discovered that the woman who had emerged from this experience was stronger and more self-aware than the person who had trusted so completely. The friends who remained after our dramatic separation were those who valued honesty and loyalty, and new relationships I formed were built on careful mutual respect rather than passionate intensity. I had learned to appreciate the security that came from truly knowing the people in my life. And I no longer confused emotional intensity with genuine connection or mistook smooth charm for authentic character. 1 year after our wedding day, I received an unexpected package with no return address containing a handwritten letter from David and what appeared to be financial documents. My first instinct was to throw it away without reading it, but curiosity eventually won out, and I opened the letter while sitting in the garden of my new home. David's handwriting was as familiar as ever, but his words carried a tone of defeat and exhaustion that was completely different from the confident charm I remembered. He began by acknowledging that he had no right to contact me, and that he expected nothing from me in return, but he wanted me to know that he had been forced to confront the full extent of the damage his choices had caused to everyone who had cared about him. The letter included a detailed accounting of every dollar he had taken from our joint accounts, along with documentation showing that he had liquidated his retirement savings and sold his car to repay the money with interest. He had also enclosed bank statements showing regular payments to his former girlfriend for money he had taken from her under false pretenses, and he explained that he was working 2 jobs to meet his financial obligations. While living in a studio apartment across town, his legal career was effectively over. His professional reputation was destroyed, and he was starting again at 32 with the kind of entry-level positions typically held by recent college graduates. The financial consequences of his deception would affect him for years to come, but he wrote that they were appropriate given the scope of his betrayal. More importantly, David's letter included what appeared to be genuine insight into the psychological patterns that had enabled his deceptive behavior, though I remained cautious about accepting his self-analysis at face value. He described months of therapy focused on understanding why he had felt entitled to maintain multiple relationships and exploit the trust of people who loved him. His therapist had apparently helped him recognize that his behavior represented a pattern of narcissistic entitlement dating back to childhood, where he had learned to manipulate adults to get what he wanted rather than developing genuine empathy or respect for others. The David who had deceived me had genuinely believed that his desires justified his actions, and he'd viewed other people as characters in his life story rather than as individuals with their own rights to honesty and consideration. The letter continued with David's acknowledgement that he had never truly loved me or his girlfriend in any authentic sense because his capacity for love had been compromised by his inability to see other people as fully real and deserving of respect. He had been attracted to me because I represented stability and social status, while his girlfriend had provided excitement and validation, but neither relationship had been based on genuine emotional connection or mutual understanding. He wrote that he was finally beginning to understand the difference between using people and loving them, though he recognized that this insight came too late to repair the damage he had caused to our lives and the lives of our families. I was struck by the apparent authenticity of David's remorse, though I remained skeptical about his motivations for writing to me after a year of silence. His description of lost friendships, damaged family relationships, and professional humiliation suggested that he was finally experiencing consequences, severe enough to force genuine self-reflection. But I wondered whether his letter represented actual growth or simply another form of manipulation, designed to make him feel better about his choices. The David I had known was extraordinarily skilled at presenting himself in whatever light would achieve his goals, and I had learned to be suspicious of any communication from him that seemed designed to elicit sympathy or forgiveness. The financial restitution he had provided was substantial and demonstrated a level of sacrifice that suggested his remorse might be genuine. But I also recognized that returning stolen money was a basic requirement of justice rather than evidence of moral transformation. His willingness to destroy his lifestyle and career prospects to make amends was significant, but it could also represent practical calculation rather than genuine change, since fighting the financial claims would have been expensive and likely unsuccessful, given the strength of the evidence against him. I found myself analyzing his letter with the same careful skepticism I now applied to all relationships, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motivations beneath the apparent honesty. After reading David's letter several times, I filed it away with the other documents from our marriage and divorce, but I did not respond to it or acknowledge receiving it in any way. He had asked for nothing from me except the opportunity to explain his actions and express his remorse, and I decided that allowing him to communicate his feelings without demanding a response was sufficient acknowledgement of his efforts at accountability. The woman who had trusted him completely was gone, replaced by someone who protected herself carefully and maintained clear boundaries with people who had demonstrated their capacity for deception. His letter had provided some insight into his psychological state, but it had not changed my assessment of his character or my decision to keep him permanently out of my life. The anniversary of our wedding day arrived with less emotional impact than I had expected, marked more by reflection on how much my life had improved than by grief for what I had lost. 2 years had passed since the wedding that changed everything, and I was surprised to discover that the anniversary no longer carried the emotional weight it once had. My life had settled into a rhythm that felt both stable and genuinely fulfilling, built on relationships and activities that reflected my authentic preferences, rather than compromises made to accommodate someone else's hidden agenda. The house I had purchased with my divorce settlement had become a true home, decorated with art I loved and filled with friends who knew my complete story and valued my strength rather than my willingness to accommodate deception. I had returned to graduate school to pursue the advanced degree I had postponed during my relationship with David, and my academic work provided intellectual challenges that reminded me of capabilities I had neglected while focusing on wedding planning and domestic expectations. The dating landscape had proven more complex than I anticipated, partly because my story was still known in our local community, and partly because my approach to new relationships had fundamentally changed after learning how thoroughly I could be deceived by someone I loved. I had developed what friends called trust but verify habits that included background checks, careful observation of behavior patterns, and gradual progression toward intimacy only after establishing consistent honesty over time. Some potential partners found my caution excessive or insulting, but those reactions actually helped me identify men who expected immediate trust without earning it, or who became defensive when asked to demonstrate their reliability through actions rather than words. I had eventually begun dating someone whose patience with my careful approach and understanding of my history suggested genuine character rather than calculated charm. Michael was a professor at the university where I was completing my degree, and our relationship had developed slowly over months of casual conversations, study sessions, and gradual recognition of shared values and genuine compatibility. He had never known David personally, but he understood that my caution came from hard-earned wisdom rather than paranoia, and he consistently demonstrated his trustworthiness through small actions that proved his words were reliable. Our relationship was built on transparency and mutual respect rather than passionate intensity, and I had learned to appreciate the security that came from truly knowing someone's character. The professional consequences for David had proven even more severe than I had anticipated, and I occasionally heard updates about his situation through mutual acquaintances, who felt I should know how thoroughly his life had changed. His legal career was permanently finished, not just because of the Bar Association's disciplinary action, but because clients and colleagues had lost confidence in his judgment and integrity. He was reportedly working in retail management, a job that provided basic income, but no opportunity for advancement or professional satisfaction. His family relationships remained strained, particularly with his father, who had never fully forgiven David's betrayal of family values and the embarrassment it had caused among their social circle. More significantly, David's capacity for forming genuine relationships appeared to have been permanently damaged by the exposure of his deceptive patterns and the social consequences that followed. Several women in our extended social network had described encounters with him, where he seemed desperate for connection but unable to be honest about his past or present circumstances. His attempts at dating had reportedly been unsuccessful, partly because his story was too well known locally, and partly because his approach to relationships remained manipulative rather than authentic. The skills that had once made him charming and persuasive now seemed calculated and desperate, and people who met him often sensed something artificial about his presentation, even when they couldn't identify specific lies. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy when I heard these updates about David's ongoing struggles, but rather a kind of detached recognition that consequences were continuing to unfold as they should. His situation served as a reminder that deception creates compound problems that extend far beyond the immediate damage to specific relationships, affecting professional opportunities, family dynamics, and future romantic prospects in ways that couldn't be easily repaired through apologies or behavioral changes. The David who had thought he could maintain multiple lives through clever management had discovered that sophisticated lies eventually collapse under their own complexity, and that rebuilding trust was far more difficult than exploiting it. The woman I had become through surviving his betrayal was someone I respected and enjoyed being. And I realized that his deception had inadvertently freed me from a relationship that would have prevented me from developing into my authentic self. The Mary who had been willing to accommodate his preferences and ignore her instincts had been replaced by someone who knew her own mind and protected her own interests, while still maintaining the capacity for love and trust, with people who had earned those gifts through consistent honesty and genuine care. 3 years after our wedding day, I received news that would test my emotional equilibrium in ways I hadn't anticipated. David had been arrested for financial fraud in connection with his current employment. According to the news reports, he had been embezzling money from his retail employer, using sophisticated accounting manipulations that suggested his deceptive skills had evolved rather than diminished since our divorce. The arrest came after a months-long investigation triggered by discrepancies discovered during a routine audit, and the evidence reportedly showed a pattern of theft spanning nearly a year. His bail was unusually high because the judge considered him a flight risk given his demonstrated history of elaborate deception and his current lack of stable community ties. The irony of David's situation was not lost on me. The man who had once seemed destined for professional success and social prominence was now facing criminal charges that would likely result in prison time and permanent exclusion from any career requiring trust or financial responsibility. His former colleagues at the law firm were reportedly shocked, but not entirely surprised, noting that someone capable of the personal deceptions he had demonstrated would likely struggle with professional ethics as well. The local legal community's response was a mixture of vindication and sadness, as they had watched a promising career self-destruct through choices that seemed incomprehensible. To people who valued integrity and long-term thinking over short-term gratification, I found myself feeling unexpectedly sad about David's arrest, not because I felt sorry for him or regretted the consequences of his choices, but because it confirmed that he had learned nothing meaningful from the destruction of his previous life. The therapy he had mentioned in his letter, the apparent insights into his psychological patterns, and the financial restitution he had made had apparently been temporary responses to crisis, rather than genuine transformation of his character. His arrest suggested that he remained fundamentally unchanged, someone who believed he could manipulate systems and people to get what he wanted regardless of the consequences, for others or the long-term sustainability of his choices. Michael, who had become a steady and trusted presence in my life, offered thoughtful perspective on my complicated feelings about David's situation. He pointed out that my sadness was actually a healthy sign of my emotional recovery, demonstrating that I could feel compassion for someone who had hurt me without losing sight of appropriate boundaries or feeling responsible for his continuing problems. The woman who had been devastated by David's betrayal 3 years ago had grown into someone who could observe his ongoing self-destruction with clarity and appropriate emotional distance. My reaction to his arrest was neither vindictive satisfaction nor inappropriate sympathy, but rather the balanced response of someone who had processed her trauma and moved forward into a healthier life. The news of David's legal troubles had an unexpected positive effect on my relationship with his parents, who contacted me to apologize once again for their son's behavior and to express their gratitude for the dignity with which I had handled our family crisis. David's mother explained that they had completely severed contact with him after learning about his recent criminal charges, having finally accepted that their son was not going through a difficult period, but was rather someone whose character was fundamentally flawed in ways that endangered everyone around him. His father had reportedly said that he no longer considered David his son and that they would not be providing bail money or legal representation for someone who had proven incapable of learning from consequences or respecting the trust of people who loved him. Their decision to cut contact completely was both heartbreaking and probably necessary, given that David's pattern of exploiting family relationships for financial and emotional support had apparently continued even after his public disgrace. His mother mentioned that he had contacted them multiple times asking for money, claiming various emergencies and promising repayment that never materialized, and they had eventually realized that he viewed them as resources to be managed rather than parents deserving respect and honesty. The grief in her voice was profound, as she described accepting that the son she had raised no longer existed, replaced by someone whose capacity for deception and exploitation made him dangerous to anyone who cared about him. As I listened to David's mother struggle with the permanent loss of her relationship with her son, I felt grateful for my own situation and the clean separation I had achieved through my divorce. Unlike his parents, who would always carry the burden of loving someone they could no longer trust or help, I had been able to close that chapter of my life completely and build something new on the foundation of hard-earned wisdom. David's continuing self-destruction was no longer my concern or responsibility, and I could observe it with the detached interest of someone reading about a stranger's poor choices in the newspaper. The woman I had become was someone David had never actually known, and she was someone who would never again be vulnerable to the kind of manipulation he represented. 5 years after the wedding that ended my marriage before it truly began, I was preparing for another wedding. This time, my own celebration with Michael planned with the careful attention to character and authenticity that I had learned to value above romantic gestures or social expectations. Our relationship had developed slowly and deliberately, built in daily demonstrations of honesty, reliability, and mutual respect, rather than passionate intensity or dramatic declarations. Michael had proven his trustworthiness through years of consistent behavior, transparent communication, and patient understanding of my need to verify emotions through actions rather than accepting promises at face value. The guest list for our wedding was smaller, but more meaningful than the elaborate celebration I had planned with David, including only people who had demonstrated genuine care for our well-being and who understood the significance of the promises we were making to each other. My parents were thrilled to see me marrying someone whose character they could respect and trust, and they had developed a warm relationship with Michael that was based on authentic appreciation rather than polite acceptance of my choice. His family had welcomed me with the kind of straightforward warmth that came from people who valued honesty and had nothing to hide. And their conversations with me were refreshingly direct and free from the subtle manipulation I had learned to recognize in social interactions. David's name was never mentioned during our wedding planning, but his influence was present in every decision we made about transparency, financial arrangements, and communication with our families. Michael and I had discussed our complete financial situations, shared access tool accounts, and established patterns of decisioning that protected both our individual interests and our joint goals. We had also talked extensively about our expectations for marriage, our approaches to conflict resolution, and/or commitments to honesty, even when the truth was difficult or uncomfortable. The relationship we were formalizing had been tested through disagreements, stress, and external challenges, and we had consistently chosen transparency and mutual support over self-protection or manipulation. The ceremony itself washled in the garden of our shared home, surrounded by friends and family members who had watched our relationship develop and could testify to its foundation of genuine compatibility and mutual respect. I wore a dress I had chosen because I loved it, not because it fit traditional expectations or would photograph well for social media. And our vows were personal promises we had written together, based on our actual experiences of loving each other rather than romantic ideals borrowed from movies or magazines. The officiating minister was someone who had counseled us extensively and could speak authentically about our readiness for marriage and our commitment to the hard work of building a life together. As I stood next to Michael, exchanging rings and promising to love and honor him through whatever challenges we might face, I thought briefly about the naive young woman who had made similar promises to David, without understanding what they truly meant. The difference was not just in the men I had chosen to marry, but in my own capacity for recognizing authentic love and protecting it through wise choices rather than blind trust. The woman who had been devastated by betrayal had grown into someone who could offer her heart fully while maintaining the wisdom to ensure it was being offered to someone worthy of that gift. Our reception was a relaxed celebration of genuine community with toasts that reflected real knowledge of our characters and relationships and conversations that were honest and meaningful rather than performative. Several guests mentioned how different this wedding felt from typical celebrations, noting the sense of authenticity and joy that came from witnessing two people who clearly knew and respected each other completely. The photographer captured moments of real laughter and connection rather than posed romantic imagery, and the evening concluded with dancing and conversations that felt natural rather than obligatory. Later that night, as Michaela and I sat together in our garden, reviewing the day and talking about our hopes for the future, I realized that David's betrayal had ultimately been a gift that had forced me to develop the wisdom and strength necessary to recognize and protect authentic love. Without the devastating education I had received about human capacity for deception, I might never have learned to appreciate the rare value of someone whose words and actions aligned consistently over time. The pain David had caused had been real and significant, but it had also prepared me to recognize and value the extraordinary man I had now chosen to spend my life with. The wedding night that followed was everything our first attempt at marriage should have been. Honest, intimate, and full of promise for a future built on truth rather than illusion. 7 years had passed since the day I discovered David's betrayal, and my life with Michael had settled into the kind of steady happiness that I had once thought was boring, but now understood was precious. We had purchased a larger home together, combining our resources and planning for the future with the transparency and mutual respect that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. I had completed my graduate degree and was working in a career that provided both intellectual satisfaction and financial independence. While Michael had received tenure at the university and was conducting research that was gaining national recognition in his field, our marriage was built on daily choices to prioritize honesty and kindness, and we had navigated the normal challenges of shared life without losing sight of the values that had brought us together. We had also started discussing the possibility of having children, a conversation that brought up unexpected feelings about the future I had once planned with David and the family we might have created based on his lies. The thought of raising children with someone whose character I could trust completely was both exciting and sobering as I realized how different my perspective on parenting had become after learning about the long-term consequences of deception and manipulation. Michael and I talked extensively about the kind of family environment we wanted to create, emphasizing honesty, emotional intelligence, and respect for others as foundational values we would model and teach through our own behavior. The news that reached me on a quiet Tuesday morning would test my emotional equilibrium in ways I hadn't expected. David had died in a car accident, alone and apparently intoxicated, while driving home from his job at a warehouse where he had been working since his release from prison. The details provided by his former colleague who called to inform me were sparse, but painted a picture of someone whose life had continued spiraling downward after his criminal conviction. He had served 18 months in minimum security prison, been released to a halfway house, and eventually found employment in manual labor that provided basic income, but no opportunity for professional or personal growth. My first reaction to the news was not grief or satisfaction, but rather a kind of hollow recognition that David's story had reached its logical conclusion. The man who had once seemed destined for success and social prominence had died alone, estranged from his family, with no close relationships or meaningful accomplishments to mark his passing. His death was not tragic in the sense of unfulfilled potential, because his potential had been destroyed by his own choices long before the accident that ended his life. Instead, it felt like the final chapter of a cautionary tale about the compound consequences of deception and the impossibility of building authentic happiness on a foundation of lies. Michael responded to my news about David's death with the thoughtful compassion that had characterized his approach to all aspects of our relationship. recognizing that I might have complicated feelings about the conclusion of a story that had shaped my understanding of trust and love. He suggested that I take time to process whatever emotions arose, and he offered to accompany me to David's funeral if I felt it would provide closure or serve some other meaningful purpose. His response reminded me once again of the difference between someone who truly cared about my well-being and someone who would have used my emotional reaction to manipulate or control me. After thinking about it for several days, I decided not to attend David's funeral, recognizing that my presence would serve no purpose for me or for the few people who had maintained relationships with him, despite his continuing problems. The closure I needed had come through building a life with someone who deserved my trust and love, not through witnessing the burial of someone who had forfeited any claim to my emotional energy years ago. David's death was sad in the way that any wasted life was sad, but it was not my tragedy to grieve or my responsibility to commemorate. Instead, I spent that day working in our garden with Michael, planting flowers and vegetables that would grow and thrive in the rich soil we had prepared together. As we worked side by side, discussing our plans for the space and enjoying the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful together, I felt grateful for the lessons that had led me to recognize and value authentic partnership. David's death marked the end of a chapter in my life that had begun with devastating betrayal and concluded with hard-earned wisdom about the difference between love and manipulation, between trust and naivety, and between the relationships that nourish us and those that diminish us. The woman who had once been willing to ignore her instincts in favor of romantic ideals had grown into someone who could distinguish between genuine care and skillful performance. And that growth had enabled me to find and protect the kind of love that was worth the risk of vulnerability. 10 years after the wedding that ended almost as soon as it began, I received an unexpected visitor who would provide the final piece of understanding about David's character and the scope of his deception. A young woman named Sarah knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, introduced herself as David's half-sister, and asked if she could talk to me about the brother she had never really known. Her existence was news to me as David had never mentioned having siblings, and her story would reveal that his capacity for deception extended even to his basic family history and personal identity. Sarah explained that she had been trying to understand David's life and death as part of her own process of making sense of a family history that had been hidden from her throughout her childhood. Sarah's mother had been David's father's mistress for several years during David's teenage years, and Sarah had been born when David was 16. The affair had been kept secret from David's mother and from David himself, and Sarah had grown up knowing that she had an older half-brother, but having no contact with him or his family. After David's death, Sarah had begun researching his life partly out of curiosity, and partly because she was concerned about genetic predispositions to the self-destructive behaviors that had characterized his adult years. Her investigation had led her to court records from our divorce, news articles about his legal troubles, and eventually to my current address through public record searches. What Sarah told me about David's family background provided crucial context for understanding how someone could develop such sophisticated skills in deception and manipulation while maintaining a facade of normalcy and success. David had apparently known about his father's affair and Sarah's existence for years, but he had never told anyone, including me, because he was using the information to manipulate his father's behavior and extract financial support. David's father had been paying him substantial sums of money periodically, believing he was helping his son with legitimate expenses, when David was actually extorting him by threatening to reveal the affair to his mother and destroy their marriage. The financial manipulation had been even more extensive than I had realized during our relationship, with David receiving regular payments from his father that he'd hidden from me and used to fund his double life. Sarah had discovered bank records showing that David's father had been transferring money to him monthly for years, amounts that would have made our joint financial planning completely different if I had known about this additional income. David had presented himself to me as someone who was struggling to establish his career and needed my financial support, while he was actually receiving substantial family money that he was hiding and using for his own purposes. Sarah also revealed that David's relationship with his parents had been built on mutual manipulation rather than genuine family affection with David, exploiting his father's guilt and his mother's love to maintain financial support while providing them with minimal honesty or respect in return. His parents' apparent shock at his betrayal of me had been somewhat disingenuous, as they had been dealing with his dishonesty and manipulation for years, but had hoped that marriage would stabilize his behavior. They had welcomed me warmly, partly because they believed I might be a positive influence on their son. But they had never warned me about his established patterns of deception because they were embarrassed about their family's dysfunction. Most significantly, Sarah's research had uncovered evidence that David's deceptive behavior had begun much earlier than I had realized, with a pattern of academic dishonesty, relationship betrayals, and financial manipulation that dated back to high school. His college friends, who had seemed surprised by his treatment of me, had actually been protecting him by not revealing stories about his previous behavior that would have provided important warnings about his character. The David I had fallen in love with had been performing a character he had perfected over years of practice, and my trust had been just the latest in a series of successful manipulations he'd conducted throughout his adult life. Sarah's visit provided a strange form of closure by confirming that my experience with David had not been an aberration or a temporary moral failure on his part, but rather the predictable result of deep-seated character problems that had affected everyone who had tried to maintain relationships with him. Her description of a family built on secrets, manipulation, and mutual exploitation explained how David had learned to view relationships as strategic opportunities rather than emotional connections, and why he had been so skilled at maintaining multiple deceptions simultaneously. The sophisticated lies he had told me were not desperate improvisations, but rather polished techniques he had been developing and refining for years. As Sarah prepared to leave, she thanked me for talking with her, and mentioned that learning about my experience had helped her understand why she had felt instinctively uncomfortable around David during the few times they had met as adults. Her intuitive recognition of his manipulative nature had protected her from developing any emotional attachment to him, and she felt grateful that she had trusted her instincts rather than trying to build a relationship with someone who would have inevitably exploited her desire for family connection. After Sarah left, I sat in my living room thinking about the final revelations about David's character and feeling oddly relieved to have confirmation that my judgment had been sound, even when my information had been incomplete. 15 years had passed since that devastating morning when I found the USB drive that changed everything, and as I prepared to celebrate my 10th wedding anniversary with Michael, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led from betrayal and heartbreak to genuine happiness and hard-earned wisdom. Our life together had become everything I had hoped marriage could be. A partnership built on mutual respect, honest communication, and daily choices to prioritize each other's well-being alongside our individual growth and dreams. We had weathered career changes, family losses, health scares, and the normal challenges of shared life without losing sight of the values that had brought us together. And our love had deepened through years of proving our commitments through actions rather than words. Our daughter Emma was now 6 years old, a bright and confident child who was growing up in an environment of emotional honesty and security that I had learned to value above all other gifts I could give her. Michael and I had been intentional about modeling healthy relationship dynamics, transparent communication, and the importance of trusting people who had earned that trust through consistent behavior over time. Emma was learning to recognize the difference between words and actions, to value character over charm, and to protect herself while remaining open to genuine connection with others. The lessons I had learned through surviving David's betrayal were being passed on to the next generation in positive ways that would serve her throughout her life. My career had flourished in ways that surprised me, partly because the confidence I had gained through protecting myself during my divorce had translated into professional assertiveness and strategic thinking that served me well in competitive environments. The woman who had once been willing to accommodate others' preferences and ignore her own instincts had evolved into someone who trusted her judgment, advocated for her interests, and built professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than pleasing behavior. My experience with David had taught me to recognize manipulation and exploitation in all contexts, skills that had proven valuable in navigating workplace politics and business relationships throughout my career. The financial security Michael and I had built together was based on transparency, shared goals, and individual responsibility rather than the naive trust that had made me vulnerable to David's theft and deception. We maintained both joint and individual accounts, discussed all major financial decisions together, and regularly reviewed our progress toward long-term goals we had established through honest conversations about our values and priorities. Our financial partnership reflected the same principles of honesty and mutual respect that characterized every other aspect of our relationship, and we had created the kind of economic stability that supported our family's security without creating opportunities for exploitation or betrayal. I occasionally thought about David and wondered what his life might have been like if he had chosen honesty over manipulation, authentic connection over strategic relationships, and long-term integrity over short-term gratification. His death at 38 had ended a life that had never reached its potential. Not because of external circumstances or bad luck, but because of fundamental character flaws that had prevented him from building anything meaningful or lasting. The tragedy of his story was not that he had faced consequences for his choices, but that he had never learned to make different choices, even when the consequences became severe enough to destroy everything he claimed to value. The woman I had become through surviving his betrayal was someone I respected and enjoyed being. And I realized that his deception had inadvertently provided me with the education and motivation necessary to build a life of authentic happiness rather than settling for the compromise and accommodation that had characterized my relationship with him. The pain he had caused had been real and significant, but it had also prepared me to recognize and protect the extraordinary love I had found with Michael. Without the devastating lesson David had taught me about human capacity for deception, I might never have developed the wisdom necessary to distinguish between genuine partnership and skillful manipulation. As Michael and I celebrated another year of marriage surrounded by friends and family who knew our complete story and could testify to the strength of our relationship, I felt grateful for every difficult lesson that had led me to this moment. The USB drive that had destroyed my first marriage had ultimately saved me from a lifetime of unknowing exploitation, and the woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal on their wedding day had grown into someone capable of recognizing, creating, and protecting authentic love. The story that had begun with devastating betrayal had concluded with hard-earned wisdom, genuine happiness, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from building a life based on truth rather than illusion. I had learned that the most important relationship skill was not the ability to trust completely, but rather the wisdom to trust appropriately. And that distinction had made all the difference in creating a life worth living. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, as it's a free way to support me. What would you have done in my situation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what story you'd like.